Here is how what was supposed to be a well-prepared trench raid turned into such a one-sided obliteration that the soldiers eventually stopped firing and came out of their trenches to help the enemy recover the dead and wounded. Today I'm going to tell you about one of the worst trench raids, and one of the weirdest plot twists of the First World War. By the beginning of 1917, the Western Front had been a static killing ground for 2.5 years now. Those major offensives, like the infamous Somme or Verdun, had all turned into months of bloodbath and then ended pretty much in the exact same places where they started, with nothing changed except over 1 million men being killed or wounded. So this is where the trench raiding concept came from. When the smart-ass generals saw that sending more men to die wasn't working, they turned their attention to small-scale raids instead. Because even if the mission completely failed, it would be covered up like nothing happened. Also, such missions could gain valuable intelligence or achieve a specific goal, making them more effective with fewer men dying. So instead of weeks of artillery preparation and thousands of men going over the top in one big charge, the small raiding party would cross no man's land during the night, silence sentries, and then, as the word says, raid the enemy trench. They'd quickly do the thing they came for, destroy something, snatch a live prisoner to be interrogated or whatever, and then sprint back to their side before the enemy reinforcements arrived. You know, hopefully. Many such missions went horribly wrong from the start, like the one I'm telling you about in this video. Only this one took it to a whole new level when it comes to everything that could go wrong, actually going wrong in so many ways. Anyway, with everything else having failed, the Allies turned to this trench raiding idea to attempt to break the trench deadlock, and who knows, perhaps even win the war. Canadians were among the nations that first started trench raiding missions, and like their fellow Germans, pushed the concept really hard. It started out pretty much improvised in the field, and a few successful raids encouraged them to scale up. The raids became better planned, with more men handpicked for the job they had to do. So through the winter of 1916 to 17, the Canadian Corps launched some 60 separate raids, and captured over 300 German soldiers, killed many more, and gathered a bunch of intelligence. However, like I said, it was now early 1917, and the Allies were planning a big new spring offensive. The French would lead the main attack on a sector called Aisne. The British would launch a supporting attack from the town of Arras, and as part of the British attack, the Canadian Corps we mentioned would be given a very specific job. That was to take Vimy Ridge. Now, Vimy is a long, high ridge near Arras, sticking above the flat plain. The Germans had taken it in 1914 and had been sitting there for over 2 years now, really well protected and looking down on the Allied lines. The French lost 150,000 men in 2 attempts to take it, and by the time the Canadians got the job, it was probably the strongest German position on that part of the front. The plan was to attack it on April 9th, 1917, with all 4 Canadian divisions going up the ridge together. But before that, something completely unexpected was about to happen. In the months leading up to the attack, every Canadian division was running raids on the German trenches across from them to gather intelligence and prepare their troops for the real deal. Although the main reason is a bit unbelievable at first glance. You see, the division that had the most success in their raids got the most attention from the high command, so this actually became their main focus, where they were literally competing over who would pull off a more audacious raid, and rack up more results in killed or captured Germans or positions destroyed. This is why the 4th Canadian Division, which was the newest, youngest division with a staff hungry to prove itself, decided to do something no one had attempted before. They wanted to launch the largest Canadian raid so far, with about 1,500 men, and not just that, but also on the worst possible piece of ground, against Hill 145. That was the 145-meter tall hill, hence the name, the highest and most heavily defended point of the entire German position. If it worked, the 4th would take Hill 145 a full month before the scheduled battle on April 9th. So they'd be the biggest, boldest, and most praised raiders of the war. You know, classic human mammalian pride at its finest. They had the idea to create a massive cloud of poisonous gas at the German trenches on this hill, which would kill the German soldiers, and then the infantry would get in and mop up. No artillery would be fired at all, because they wanted complete surprise. So the barbed wire would be cut by the explosive tubes carried by the troops. The plan was finalized in the second half of February 1917, and the gas cylinders started moving up to the front like every night. These things were heavy steel cylinders, around 100 pounds each, and they would be placed in frontline trenches. When the wind was right, they'd open the valves and the poisonous gas would be carried to the German side and ruin their day. By the end of the month, they had over 2,000 cylinders set up at the front line across 2 main attack directions, ready to be opened. Now, as I said, the operation depended on the favourable wind to carry that gas where they wanted it. The British Special Brigade officers had the instruments to measure the wind, so when the conditions were right, the code word CAT would be passed back to division headquarters, and until then everybody was waiting. However, the wind didn't cooperate, so the operation was postponed a few times. And a bunch of soldiers alongside gas cylinders mounted in racks along the firing step at the parapet, all waiting together at the front line, weren't exactly the best idea. Because if something happened, like an artillery shell hitting the cylinders, it could make for a really bad day. Well, guess what happened? A shell hit the cylinders in one spot and gas started leaking, but the Canadians couldn't raise the gas alarm in the middle of the night, because this would tell the Germans exactly what was going on. So they passed the word through the trenches quietly, and for a few unfortunate groups, it was too late. And when we mentioned the surprise, well, it was a bit too late for that as well. You see, while the Canadians were moving a bunch of those heavy gas cylinders during the night, it was everything but a silent, invisible process. Hundreds of men hauling thousands of heavy metal things were noticed by the soldiers on the other side, who carefully listened for any move at night. At the same time, French civilians behind the Canadian lines clearly knew that something was up, and if they knew, the Germans also had to know. And as if that wasn't enough, 2 German prisoners taken in earlier raids managed to escape from the Canadian compound and make it back to their lines with details of the gas plan. Even the German tunnelers who dug through the chalk all the way to the Canadian lines had listening posts close enough to absolutely know that something was cooking. All in all, the Germans pretty much knew that the attack was coming, how it was coming, and where it was coming from. So they prepared. They put their experienced units on the hill, with gas protection and orders that if they saw gas being released, they should fire the flares, and the German artillery would blast the whole area where the gas was coming from. Now, the Canadians weren't stupid, at least not all of them. The very commanders of the battalions going into the operation realized that the whole thing was compromised, and logically, they pushed back on the plan, especially for the gas part and complete loss of surprise. But as always, the High Command knew better. They had put too much preparation into the whole thing for it to be just cancelled, so the plan went forward. Battalion commanders were strictly forbidden to go into battle with their men, and ordered to stay at headquarters and command from there. However, they would ignore this order. On the morning of March 1st, the wind finally began to work for the Canadians, and the men waiting in assembly trenches for 3 days were tired and cold, but at least happy the operation was finally starting. At 3 a.m., the mixture of chlorine and phosgene gas was released from the cylinders. The wind was just perfect at first, and it moved the poisonous cloud across no man's land toward the German trenches. But if you remember what I said a little earlier, the Germans were prepared, and the forward observers fired the flares the moment they saw the gas. So per prior agreement, the German artillery opened fire into the cloud and onto the Canadian front trench, while the German troops put on their new rubber gas masks. 1 hour and 45 minutes later, the second wave of cylinders was scheduled to be released. However, minutes before the release, the wind changed, and the order to not open them reached the position just in time. But in the northern sector, it arrived too late, and the valves were opened. The cloud moved a short distance toward the ridge, then slowed, then hung in the still air, and then drifted back. It went straight into the Canadian assembly trenches where the assault waves were waiting to climb their ladders. Now, most of the soldiers had their respirators on, but in a few places the gas was so dense that the troops were forced out of the trenches to wait for the signal in the open, under the German artillery bombardment. 0 hour for the infantry assault was 5:40 a.m. and by then the cloud had been on the ridge for over 2.5 hours. So the signal came. The Canadians climbed out and began their way uphill toward the German wire, across a 200-meter wide no man's land. The Germans should be gassed by now, and the Canadians should go through the gaps in the wire to capture the hill. Big emphasis on the word should here. In reality, the Germans were very much alive and ready for battle, with bayonets on their rifles aiming over the parapet, and Canadians just walked right into a wall of fire. Now, earlier that night, small scout groups went forward to find the best points where the advancing troops could later breach the German wire with those ammonal tubes, so the artillery wouldn't ruin the surprise they thought they still had. They marked the spots with white flags so the raiding parties could find them in the dark. Well, now as the Canadians were going through those gaps, the white flags basically became targets for German machine gunners. The real chaos began. The leading Canadian battalions lost about 200 men within the first 5 minutes of the attack. Surviving men jumped into shell craters for cover, but the Phosgene, which is heavier than air, had sunk into them and lingered there, which meant they couldn't even take cover without risking being gassed. But despite the complete catastrophe at the wire, there was a brief moment when the Canadians actually got into the German trench and cleared approximately a 500-meter section in horrific hand-to-hand fighting. However, then the German counterattack came and drove them back as they were too battered to defend the captured section. In other sections, just 3, 4, or 5 men reached the German trench alive, and they were killed immediately as they jumped in. The surviving Canadians were broken into small mixed groups, trying to fight their way through their own gas, while the Germans tried to flank them and cut off their retreat. Frontline officers sacrificed themselves trying to organize what was left of their men and save them. Then daylight came, while the survivors were still in no man's land and German sharpshooters just started picking them off one by one. Many men who couldn't move from their craters never left them, because they died from the gas that lingered there, and only a few managed to somehow crawl back to the Canadian line over the course of the day. The slope in front of Hill 145 was full of Canadian dead and wounded in the wire and in no man's land. The total number of men killed, missing, or wounded during the attack was 687, the worst single-night loss the Canadian Corps suffered in the entire war for an operation of this scale. And you remember those commanders who ignored the order to stay behind and went forward with their men anyway? Well, they were among those 687. When the night fell, the Canadians tried to go out into no man's land to drag back the surviving men still stuck in German wire. But German rifle fire was heavy, so the order came to call off the recovery attempts, and the wounded were left overnight. However, on the morning of March 2nd, something happened. Canadian stretcher parties went out into no man's land to clear the dead and wounded who had somehow survived the night, and they expected to be fired on as always. But they weren't. They came all the way forward to the wire, and the Germans were still not firing. Then a German non-commissioned officer came forward into no man's land alone, even without a flag, and told the Canadians that they could go on with their work in front of his section of the trench. Although he warned them not to go to the flanks because he couldn't guarantee what was going to happen there. This gesture basically shocked the Canadians, so Brigade Major David Watson wanted to go up and see if they could work out an official truce with the Germans. Now, this guy Watson is the one who pushed for this raid so much and ignored all the warnings that the mission should not go on. And he is now personally up at the front line on the morning after the disaster. But what was arranged later that day was a formal truce that almost no other section of the Western Front saw at this stage of the war. For 2 hours between 10 a.m. and noon, under a Red Cross flag, both sides met in no man's land to recover the Canadian dead. Those 2 hours felt like a weird dream to both sides. Not a single shot was fired, and none for the rest of the day either. You see, the famous Christmas truce of late 1914 had been ruthlessly suppressed by both high commands, and by 1917 neither army's officers could attempt such negotiations, even if they wanted to, for fear of being sanctioned. But what made this one possible was perhaps such a severe one-sided slaughter that both sides probably just wanted it to stop and end. Germans even returned the body of Colonel Kemble themselves, the commander who fought against this raid, who ignored the order to stay in the trench, and went with his men anyway. The news of what happened spread through the Canadian Corps and didn't really boost morale, if you get what I mean. High Command tried to minimize the casualties and cover up what had happened, but it was pretty much already too late for that. As for Hill 145, it was taken 5 weeks later when the whole offensive began, by reserve units of the 4th Canadian Division, which got obliterated in the first attempt.